Floyd Zadkovich, International Commercial Lawyers.
So I'm talking about marine plastics, and it's kind of a hot topic, I think, in the marine industry as well as just in everyday life, really. And it's interesting because plastic really hasn't been around so long. It's only really been around since the Second World War. It was used a lot during the war effort, and once the war effort ended, obviously there was a lot of production still going on, and people needed to figure out what to do with this really cheap, light, and very versatile material. So it was introduced into the consumer market, which really raised the standard of living for a lot of people, because people could now afford things because things were being made a lot more cheaply. Interestingly enough, though, in 1985, only about 25% of the groceries that were being bought at grocery stores were being carried out by plastic bags. So not that many people were still mainly using paper. Then by 1995, however, only 10 years later, it was 80%. So there was the spike. And as soon as plastic was being used more, there was also already environmental concerns about the just longevity of it. It just doesn't go anywhere. Some people don't realize is that, well, when I throw something in the trash, it goes somewhere. Well, it actually stays there forever, pretty much forever, and it just ends up breaking down into smaller and smaller pieces. And the smaller and smaller pieces are even harder to actually take out of the environment than large pieces. So every year there are about 300 million tons of plastic produced, and about half of that is for single use. So if you think about, your the orange juice cup right there, for example, or the or the yogurt cup that you're using. How long do you use that? Maybe 30 seconds or a minute, and it's going to be around forever. And a lot of it actually ends up in the oceans. So as a minimum, about 8 million tons of plastic end up in the ocean every year, and that's a lot. And there are different reasons why it ends up there. So one of the really big pollutants or causes of plastic are actually fishing nets that get lost. They end up ghost fishing, it's called. They can do that for years. So marine animals get caught in it. It can mess up vessels as well. It gets sucked in and causes a lot of damage. Then there are other things like offshore rigs. They're just surrounded by water, so anything that falls off ends up in the ocean. And then, of course, any cargo lost overboard it's the same thing. It's close to impossible to collect everything. So those are kind of the unintentional ways that plastic ends up in the ocean. And people are trying to figure out different ways. For example, tagging nets. So people are held responsible. They try harder not to lose their nets if they end up being responsible when they get found. But yeah, and then there are other ways that trash ends up in the ocean, and that's just by dumping. There are regulations against it, of course. Only certain garbage is allowed to be dumped. Plastic is obviously not one of those, but it still happens, and it's really hard to enforce because vessels are in the most remote places in the oceans, and it's hard to track. What else happens with plastic in the ocean is that it can obviously damage the habitats. We have the Great Barrier Reef and a lot of different very, very fragile ecosystems that are greatly affected by any sort of plastic. And also then the ingestion of plastic by marine animals that actually the fishing industry is greatly affected by, because there have been studies that fish ingesting plastic reduces their reproductivity. So that's horrible for the fishing industry that's already struggling with depleting resources. And of course, it ends up in the food chain, so we end up eating it as well. They're still doing studies exactly what the impact of plastic has on humans or on other animals as well. They're doing studies on birds, which are showing actually significant issues with very small amounts of plastic, really. Their stomachs also, it just sits in their stomach, so they feel they're full and they end up dying because they don't eat, which is sad. Then also, what's interesting is that it's not just plastic, also containers and other things. It's really easy for certain alien species to attach to it. And what ends up happening is that alien species from different parts of the world end up in ecosystems where they're not supposed to be. So it's not just the direct impact of the plastic or other materials. It's actually the indirect plastic effect of species entering ecosystems where they're not supposed to be, and changing that up and endangering the species that are there. So regarding some legal action, the IMO is working on things. They're actually warning that some scientists are saying that by 2050, there may be more plastic in the ocean than fish, and that's a really scary thought, because swimming in, a sea of plastic, everyone I'm sure has seen those videos of the rivers, just the waves of plastic kind of going by. And then the U.S. is doing has some statutes as well where plastic is included, just how to deal with toxic materials by the terminal or on the ocean as well. And then there's obviously the MARPOL Annex 5 and the Basel Convention. What's really hard is enforcement. A lot of the U.S. relies heavily on whistleblowers, just because people will mix trash. They'll add some plastic to the trash that is allowed to be dumped on certain areas of the ocean. So it's really hard to track. People will falsify their garbage logs to show that they're taking care of their plastics properly when they're not. And then one specific one that I wanted to focus on, which Ed brought to my attention, is the Poseidon Principles that were signed in June of this year, which kind of focuses on the vessel financing part. So it just goes to show that it's not just the vessels themselves, it's kind of the broader maritime industry that is starting to feel responsible and trying to make a movement, just because there's also a customer interest in being a little bit more responsible. So the Poseidon Principles, they're the 11 largest vessel finance banks. They are responsible for about 20% of all of ship finance around the world. And they have 4 principles that they go by, and those are assessment. So to make sure that all of their policies, or what they're asking the people that they're extending financing to, are in line with the climate obligations. Then there's accountability. So at the end of March 2020, the first reports will be published to the flag states regarding the different vessels that these individual banks have financed, to see how they're doing. And they use the IMO DCS to track that. Then there's enforcement, that's number 3. So it's hard to enforce, because these reports are technically anonymous. As soon as it goes to the IMO, the individual shippers are no longer are anonymous, so it's hard to track. So what they've encouraged is these banks to include covenants or regulation in their contracts to require the people that they finance to provide them with environmental information about their pollution and consumption and things like that. And then number 4 is transparency. So November 30th will be has been the deadline. I wonder if it's this year, I'm not sure, but going forward, November 30th will be the deadline for all of those 11 banks to provide the information to the Poseidon Principles, I think is agency, with all of the information on all of the vessels that they have financed and how they're doing. And then on December 21st, scores are provided regarding the climate alignment generally for those 11 banks. So that'll be really great. It's not just the banks that are wanting to be responsible, and they're holding the people that they are financing for responsible to be more in alignment with these general, it's the Paris Agreement and different, and the IMO standards, of course, but also the consumers and just people generally will be able to see how ships are tracking, because they are responsible for a lot of the commodities, of course. So it's great if you have green commodities, but if they're being shipped in a really dirty way, then the impact is not as great. So I think I'm just going to end on this really great note. So things are happening. A lot can be done. A lot can be done on also a personal level, of course. There are a lot of companies that are moving towards being a little bit more responsible and aware of the different things that you can do as an individual. So thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Eva. Thank you for that.